Hello, everyone. Welcome to our sixth community call. I'm Perpetua Muthoni, and I'll be your host today, along with Tatiana. Excited to have you here. Our conversation started today as Jessyca Dudley, and I'll just walk you through the flow of events. This is part of a conversation series under FEST, and the role of FEST is to accelerate the development of the field of financing systemic transformation to address some of the social inequality, economic and environmental crises, the polycrisis that we're seeing. And the people on this call are practitioners, thought leaders from different corners of the ecosystem, various stakeholders in this field. So this is a learning space. It's a place to come grapple with some of the tensions that we are seeing and thinking about. The flow of today's call, we have this welcome check-in, and we'll have a chance to connect in small groups of around 4. And then we'll have a collective inquiry process where our lovely conversation starter, Jessyca, will share for around 10 or so minutes. And then she'll leave us with a provocation, and we'll go into small groups and have some discussions about this. And then we'll come back and share in the larger group and finalize that session with a reflection from Jessyca. And then after that, we'll just have our usual updates and announcements and then close and have our checkout. So that's the flow of our call today. So I'll pass it to my co-host Tatiana to walk us through the check-in process.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, where you're calling from. I'm posting the check-in question to the chat. So drop your name, where you're calling from, and how you are arriving to this call. So it looks like we have people from Canada, people on the East Coast, more people from Chicago, Amsterdam. All right, I think we are ready to go into the breakout rooms. Your question for the breakout room is, what are some patterns in financing systemic transformation you would like to see amplified, or work you would like to see funded? Once everyone settles back in, we can hear from a couple of people.
Yeah, we talked about funding core infrastructure for learning and relationship and not being so much attached to specific outcomes that cannot be fully predicted or even evaluated. Whenever the people are in right relationship and they have intent, things happen. Of course, there are all the limitations of that approach as well, but we talked about that pattern.
Thank you.
There was a discussion in our group with Barjet and Harriet that led me to bring in this project that we're working on called Local Partners Financing Networks. Communities are forming networks for building their financial relationships and capacities. So the bioregional weaving lab is an example in Europe where they have 8 different bioregions that have connected together. So we've actually identified about 20 of these emergent and co-developing, co-creating, co-designing with them an initiative to be able to greatly expand the capacity, which they're basically trying to address the need for being able to build local sophistication in connecting with financiers and build scale in terms of the collective demand for finance and learn how to build pipelines and those types of things. So
Thank you, Steve. All right, I think we are ready to go into the collective inquiry section.
So for this next part, a refresher of our process is that we'll hear from Jessyca, which is a shift from like the presentation and Q&A format. She will share a story and context from the work she's doing for around 10 minutes, and then we'll go into breakouts for 20 minutes and then have the full group conversation for another roughly 20 minutes. And she'll close us off with some reflections. So a recap of this series. Yodo started us off in September talking about polarity between fostering systems transformation at scale and moving money based on high context relationships. Then we had Sarah Edwards having the perspective of a large scale institutional investor. Then we had Jen Vandermeer bringing the perspective of practice academic. Then we had Leon Seafield, who is a designer of the original financing facilities. And our last call, which was in March, we had Natsai Chiesa, a biotechnology innovator, talking about funding architectures that can finance systems that make technology regenerative and transformative. And so today we have Jessyca Dudley. Jessyca is a strategic advisor and social sector leader. Her work revolves a lot around reimagining wealth's role in society and really centering the idea of community-driven leadership and equitable systems. So she's the founder and CEO of Bold Ventures and has directed over $60 million to BIPOC-led organizations. And so I'll welcome Jessyca to walk us through what she has to share. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So, as we were sharing, I lead a firm called Bold Ventures. We're a strategic advisory firm, and we primarily work with institutional philanthropy to really explore how governance and strategy design can change who the decision makers are in foundations. And then on the family and individual side, we work with donors to explore aspects of repair and philanthropy that can bring them closer to a just transition. We are often working in partnerships with our clients to explore mission alignment between their values and their philanthropy and their investments. So really trying to create that straight line across. And because we're doing that in this play space of philanthropy, we're often working with family offices and wealth advisors to use philanthropy as this soft opening for conversation. So I'm particularly excited to be in the room with you all today because I know so many of you are on the investing side, and we're trying to create this bridge across sort of the play space of philanthropy into the investing side of things. So I heard that today I'm doing something a little bit different for the conversation by starting with the provocation, and then I'm going to sort of like walk through some ideas that sort of support the small group conversations on that. I was sharing with my small group, I teach a course on the history of philanthropy and social movements. And so it's real hard for me to think about this in 10 minutes. So I'm really going to focus on some of the sort of cultural things about philanthropy that limit its ability to be a partner in this transformative work. I really do love to talk about tax code and things like that. And so if there are questions about that later, I am happy to talk about those things, but I'm going to sort of focus more on the cultural side of these things, but always happy to follow up with people about sort of historical things and what's going on with tax code right now. So the provocation for today, when you think about financing systemic transformation, philanthropy should be a natural partner. We're talking about $1.5 trillion in assets that are tax-advantaged capital with no requirement of a financial return and a stated mission of focusing on the public good. So why does institutional philanthropy so often show up as a bottleneck rather than an accelerator? So for the next 10 minutes, I'm going to talk a little bit about why philanthropy operates the way it does, sort of what are the source codes built into its DNA that stop it from being a collaborator or an accelerator in this work, some of the specific narratives that prevent foundations from being an effective collaborator, and what I think it would take to shift from equity as a process to equity as a just transition as an outcome. So most people know philanthropy as its culture of giving, so generosity, charitable intent, trying to do good. I think of that as a culture of reciprocity that's always existed in human culture. And what we're actually talking about is the business of philanthropy, which is only about 250 years old in the US. And it's really about how foundations and wealth holders work alongside the wealth industry. It's something entirely different. It is not necessarily about reciprocity. And it's really something in the US that develops alongside the Industrial Revolution. And then we decided we are so great, we're going to export these ideas all over the world and sort of gunk up these sort of ideas of reciprocity that have always existed. So again, since I'm going to try and cover a lot of history in a little bit of time, I welcome sort of follow-up questions on this. So the sort of core source code document that we have for philanthropy in the US, we get in the 1800s when Carnegie writes his sort of blueprint for the business of philanthropy and the gospel of wealth. And that argues that wealthy people should give away their fortunes, but those wealth holders are the best stewards of that capital because they have expertise. And this really establishes about 200 years of ideas that are codified through tax code and legal precedent and social norms that are these sort of five source codes of philanthropy. So the first one would be expertise, which we get from Carnegie, that foundations and wealth holders believe they know better communities and are better positioned to make decisions for them without them in the room. Because this work comes out of the Industrial Revolution, we have these ideas about scale, that bigger is better, replication is more important than locally rooted, context-worthy work. There's always got to be innovation, so new solutions will always be prioritized over sustaining and supporting what's working. A lot of the US philanthropy was actually built by consultants who had worked in the government. And so they bring these ideas of measurement to the idea of public good. So if you can't quantify it, it doesn't count. We need to be able to physically count outcomes. And then this really strange idea that philanthropy is neutral, right? This idea that like we are apolitical, we are objective, we are not sort of down in the dirt of making decisions about sort of outcomes for folks, even though that sort of is in direct content to the expertise, scale, and innovation side of this. And I think all of this matters for financing transformation because these codes created this fundamental problem where foundations are designed to control capital deployment, not to collaborate in capital deployment, right? The structure itself, that it's tax advantage, that there are perpetual endowments with no accountability to the public, really enforces this over and over again. So there's a number of narratives that we sort of hold in philanthropy without maybe investigating them or truly understanding them. We just think of them as the norms of the sector. They're sort of the stories that foundations tell themselves that prevent them from showing up as effective partners and really thinking about how we could finance this transformation. But they're so strong and unquestioned, these almost God messages that like we don't consider where they're showing up. So one of the ones we hear often, our capital is philanthropic, it's doing good in the world, we're part of the solution, we couldn't be a part of the problem. And in reality, most foundation wealth came from extraction, right? Labor extraction, environmental extraction, wealth concentration, right? All of those sort of pieces are the harms that we're actually seeing social challenges present as, right? Without those initial harms, we wouldn't have these social challenges that philanthropy is then coming in to fix. And if we can't acknowledge that the capital caused that harm to the communities we're intending to support, we can't really honestly like participate in any kind of transformation. We also hear we fund evidence-based solutions, or we know what works at scale. And we know sort of from those source codes that foundation expertise often means credentials. That doesn't mean proximity. And so it means that we're like not actually working with folks who are challenged by any of these social problems that we say we want to solve in the decision making or the development or the work of like directing that capital. It's really controlled by folks who maybe never have proximity to those challenges. And so we know that real collaboration means ceding decision making power, but the narratives of philanthropy really get in the way of that. And then one of the last ones that I think is really important is that we hear that foundations are accountable to impact rather than accountable to the effectiveness of their work. And so we really are sort of, I think of philanthropy as like curators of impact without any self-reflection on its own sort of input to this. And so if you think that sort of impact is process improvement, you're still centering the foundation's control rather than engaging in true collaboration, redistribution of decision-making power. It's really just about streamlining a set of transactions. Okay. So what would it actually take for philanthropy to show up as a genuine collaborator in financing the systemic change? I think there's three primary shifts that we need to think about. So one is, how do we get philanthropy to become an accomplice, right? To acknowledge that foundation wealth came from causing systemic harm, to show up as accountable to communities and repairing those communities rather than these sort of benevolent outsiders who are solving problems. And how can we sort of like truly come into relationships and understand how capital can support someone else's vision rather than our capital implementing our solutions? I think some of that looks like more participatory grant making, participatory investing, where we are changing the decision makers around this capital. I certainly think it looks like funding, organizing, and advocacy, not just service delivery. I talk in my course a lot about movement capture and the way that philanthropy has really encouraged communities to become reliant on other nonprofit systems rather than building a true safety net for folks. We're not that interested in actually having social innovation. What we want to do is say solving food insecurity means becoming reliant on a food bank rather than actually solving for food insecurity, and that sort of keeps the system going. Philanthropy certainly needs to get proximate. So, really recognizing what it means to have lived experience and understanding that as expertise, which means shifting decision makers, valuing proximity over credentials. And that again really goes to who's making decisions, who is closest to this challenge, and like how do we think about funding the work that can lead to change rather than funding outcomes. And I know that this was a part of your previous conversation. I love the story about mushrooms because I think it so perfectly captures one of the challenges of philanthropy and thinking about like we have to have this outcome and we don't care about the context that led to that outcome. And then the last one is really about understanding full accountability, right? I think one of the core problems in philanthropy is that accountability sits between folks within the foundation and the board rather than accountability flowing to communities that you're supposed to serve. There is some really incredible writing sort of at the beginning of philanthropy in the US about founder intent and the cold, dead hand of the founder influencing future generations. And we still need to have a robust conversation about that and change how we think about accountability. So I do think philanthropy can be a powerful collaborator in this transformation, but only if we're really willing to really interrogate the narratives that we've inherited as a part of this sector, sort of acknowledge our complicity in the systems that are causing harm, and really start to think about how we can redistribute power. So I think there's a lot to talk about on like the policy and the tax side, but I know I only had 10 minutes, and I know that we're going to have some small group and some big group conversations. So hopefully we can dig a little bit deeper into some of the specific examples or way to do this work.
Thank you, Jessyca. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your presentation. All right. I think we are now ready to go back to the breakout rooms. Our question is, with 1.5 trillion in assets, tax advantaged capital with no requirement of financial return, and stated missions focused on the public good, philanthropy should be a natural partner in financing systemic transformation at scale, yet it often shows up as a bottleneck rather than an accelerator. What knowledge, partnerships, and actions can unlock more of these assets for a just transition?
Welcome back. Seems like we had a lot of good conversations in the breakouts. Does anyone want to start us off?
We had a great conversation about a number of things. We still work in silos in many ways. When we look at decades of work in the United States, for example, reparatory capital, racial justice, solidarity economy, that is not often present in some of the systemic investing, systemic finance conversations, and vice versa. I was given an example of Seed Commons that has given $123 million in non-extractive loans in the United States and has addressed some of the challenges that I hear are being discussed as systemic investing standards are being offered or philanthropic conversations. Obviously, to give non-extractive loans, you need philanthropic capital. So a lot of the principles and practices are already being out there, and it's coming together and breaking down the silos that could really boost collaboration and unleash the potential.
Thank you for sharing, Fyodor. Anyone else want to build on that or offer an alternative perspective?
Yeah, I just want to say how grateful I am for Jessica's discussion of the source codes. I've spent a good chunk of my career pushing against those without having such clear naming and the historical context. And I definitely will be sitting with that and hopefully acting from that. So I think it's just a huge boost of energy and clarity, and I'm really grateful. Thank you.
Something that we had come up in our group was noting that, I mean, some of the decision-making foundations, or often the decision-making foundations isn't necessarily made from the very top. It's not by wealth holders. Like they give the wealth and they just hand it over to kind of professionals to staff it up or to like kind of make the decisions. But the question there is like who comprises the staff and like what is their training, what are their kind of incentive structures as well. So I think, and often it seems that it's a lot of ex-finance folks or ex-management consultants folks, and it's not, nothing against them. I think they're great people, but it is like it's a very specific kind of style of training. And particularly in the finance world, it's quite opposite to, or very different from like a systems finance perspective. The puzzle piece here is how do you staff up these organizations differently, and how do you change their own, even the incentives of program officers, what counts as impactful or what raises their profile or status within these organizations?
There are three things that stood out from the breakout room I was in. A lot of truth bombs. So one is whether or not there's an emphasis on actually solving problems directly. So the difference between investing in research to influence policy to prevent gun violence versus trying to find direct interventions that would stop gun violence, and how commitment or lack thereof to core problem solving reflects on the focus on where the power lies. So Jessyca pointed out that the power is where the investing is, but there's a lot of emphasis on the programmatic side. The second bit was about dislocations, essentially. So the idea that the logic of blended finance has been resting on USAID as a funder. And now that USAID as a funder has essentially disappeared, people are starting to ask, have discovered Donella Meadows, and are starting to ask critical questions about what they should be doing, that emerges from a basically shift in the system. And then the last bit is, I guess, about truth telling. It was a bit of a mic drop in the sense of there has been a history of reciprocity that has been longer than philanthropy as a philosophy, if you like. So part of it has to do with getting back to what is actually true. So basically, I learned a lot from Jessyca and Jen in that conversation.
Thank you. Jen?
Yeah, I feel like I don't have to speak because Tayo shared. I really wanted to help emphasize that point, which connects back to what Fyodor said as well, which is a way to decenter power is simply to acknowledge that there are governance practices that are older than philanthropy, will go way back and are stronger the closer you get to folks that had to like pool their resources together to survive. And we've disabled those in the US and around the world. And so how do we recenter what is actually older governance structures that don't come from philanthropy and don't come from the Chicago Booth School and don't come from management principles, MBA, but we're already there.
One of the things we talked about in our group was sunsetting of foundation spend downs, the assumption that philanthropic institutions should exist in perpetuity is driving a lot of the investment decisions. So that $1.5 trillion in capital, right? So that they can keep on giving away money and paying their staff, et cetera, and that there are examples, Lankley Chase, Chorus Foundation, maybe others of philanthropic institutions saying we're going to go away, right? Spend down. And how that's done, the shift that Jessyca named in moving power to community, shifting it to the people who are most impacted and stand to benefit from however that money is deployed is not trivial. And so in the case of the Chorus Foundation, for example, they took 10 years to build up the capacity of the different groups and communities they were working with so that they could wisely take over the governance functions.
And Ben, just to build on that, I think it's such an important point because like the choice to have philanthropy exist in perpetuity is a choice we made rather recently. The minimum spend for philanthropy used to be much higher, and we reduced it to 5% so that we could have more opportunities for philanthropy to exist in perpetuity, because it used to be closer to 10% and foundations were not able to continue to function because they were doing more in grant making than they were making in returns. And so there's all these sort of recent moments where we've sort of reaffirmed these norms from like a tax or a policy standpoint. And one of the things we talked about was like, could philanthropy be incentivized to shift that? And my perspective is that it cannot, that it has to be regulated to do that. And we know how to do that, and we continue to choose not to.
I can jump in briefly here, and building on Jessyca, what you raised right from the outset, I think made it possible to peel back more layers in the conversations that we were having, and acknowledging how measurement by nature, and the way I've described is, cuts out huge swaths of living reality by putting things into narrow metrics. And where we ended up, and it was a question that Isaac raised, was, I mean, there was a lot of alignment around the things that we were thinking, and the question that I've been asking is, what needs to stop? And what do we really mean by just transition when we think about what's been attempted for many, many years, and how this is rooted in much deeper patterns that go back hundreds of years, actually. But Isaac raised the question of, if we need to let go and stop, what are the new anchors? And I think where I was heading, and the conversation ended at that point, was attractors. What's the pull? I think maybe a conversation about what will draw people and pull people in a direction that's more life affirming, and that where we come and face each other as partial witnesses around these issues, instead of such an expert perspective, because nobody's really got this. This is bigger than all of us. It's been going on for way long. We bring our gifts differing, and clearly from the conversation that you opened up here, Jessyca, you're bringing some wonderful gifts to this conversation, and you're inviting us to bring our gifts as well. But we're touching on issues that touch on all domains of society and deeply ingrained dominator patterns that we've all grown up with and we're very used to. But thank you.
There's another challenge for the people that we are paying in change work. Are we paying them to continue living in the default economy? Are we also thinking about, like, I know for myself, I just need to live on land with community, and I don't actually want or need that much material flow through. But if I'm still in a default world position of like needing money for my mortgage in my nice suburb. So that's one thread, and I was just to type in another thread, which is actually the coming energy crisis, the waves of unemployment, AI unemployment. Like, there is these significant radical shifts about to hit the US economy and the global economy. And things could really, I have this image of turning into goo. So the folks who have a clearer vision of what's on the other side of that, with a rewired economy of local food systems, of caring for our neighbors, and basically withdrawing our labor from the corporate world, there's radical change happening that's just ahead of us. And I feel like there's so much lack of imagining into that and seizing this moment. But I think there's a huge opportunity too.
To build on Clea's point, I sometimes feel like I would love personally, and I have spent some time in visioning that third horizon that we want to walk toward. And I think that this moment is ripe for that. And I've engaged in some beautiful practices, one from Janella Meadows, she has an amazing visioning process. And also we just hosted Ingrid Lafleur, who's an Afrofuturist who offers a very beautiful practice around visioning as well. So I think it would be very invigorating for us to take the time to spend more time in that imagining place. And separately, I think, we have a lot of learning to do from communities who are responding to climate disasters and who are building their way back from that. The resilience stories that they offer are extremely instructive and I think fortifying.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for your reflections. I think I can pass this back to Jessyca. You can have a few minutes, around 4 minutes, of giving us your closing remarks on this.
Well, I want to thank you all for engaging in this. I think that within philanthropy, because folks are sort of holding this dual space of both wanting to do good work and sort of swimming in the waters of philanthropy, it can often be hard to have these conversations. So really appreciating the space to pull back the curtain a little and talk about some of these systems and how they function. I think it does take quite a bit of outside pressure for philanthropy to change. And so I think more people surrounding philanthropy, understanding how it works, understanding its limitations, maybe not holding it up as a best practice, is so important. And really thinking about this idea that like our longer human history is really centered around reciprocity, and this idea of generosity that operates in philanthropy that's very one-directional and controlling of resources is a fairly new practice. And is it the practice we really want to stick with, or do we want to take some learning from those longer histories that we have to really center those in how we move forward? I so agree that like we haven't clearly articulated what this third horizon feels like, tastes like, feels like for people. And so we're having a really hard time, and Dot, I'm going to be using attractors from now on, attracting people to that place because they don't have a clear understanding of where they're being led to. And what is the work that we can all do to do that, that makes sort of the wealth holding and the narratives of wealth hoarding in the US less attractive. But we've really held that up as, like a God term that doesn't get questioned, that we don't have to hold wealth accountable, that we don't have an ability to really challenge it because we've isolated it and made it something that is so special and so unique and that everyone is striving towards without a counter narrative. There's some really incredible research that we've really started to lean on actually the harms that happen for individuals when they are extreme wealth holders. We know there's a lot of harms to the democracy, there's a lot of harm to community, but there's also harm for those individuals. And how do we really start to get folks to understand that that side of extreme outsized wealth is not winning, and what is an articulation of sort of a positive outcome that we want to have in the world. So really appreciate it. Really would be delighted to stay in conversation with you all. I think it's in these spaces where we sort of cross our sectors and our language and our frameworks that we get a much deeper understanding. I've taken so much from getting to hear from you all that I want to bring into this and help folks understand and connect them to other ways of thinking about this. So just really appreciate being with you all this morning.
Thank you so much, Jessyca. We appreciate all that you've shared and the conversation that you've started today. And I will pass this back to Fyodor and Jen for updates and announcements.
Thank you. Next month, we have a conversation with Taj James, Full Spectrum Group. That will be the closing session for the Coherence Across Scales series. So we really want to reflect a little bit on the 6 calls that we've had so far. And thank you so much, Jessyca. That has been so wonderful today. It's already has given a lot of material for thought about how to frame the closing. So yeah, May 21st is the next call and same time. And then State of the Field gathering. We will have our first World Cafe at the time of our regular community call in June. That's the third Thursday of the month, June 18th. Please, if you want to contribute to conversations about what's happening in the field of financing systemic transformation, please fill out the form sooner rather than later. And the deadline is May 21st. That will be the first experiment that we do. We hope to do it twice a year and track the evolution of the field. And with that, Jen, it's all yours.
Great. First is our finance fellowship. We've been running an experiment. To the right of this are some of the FEST groups I'll talk about. One of them is the FEST finance group, where we work on the business model of FEST and also our engagement with finance collaborators and partners and other systemic investing partners. And this is our first attempt to float something out there in the field, which is a fellowship money to support people that are close to systems change, actually showing up in these spaces where systemic finance conversations, theories, and narratives are being formed. I'll place that call here in the chat. If you have folks you want to nominate, we've been a little sluggish to get the first money out. We're working on the piping of that. But I then bring you to the next slide. These are our FEST groups. So if you're new to FEST, this is how we organize. So far, we've been an entirely volunteer-based organization with contributions coming from some members. Here's how we organize: FEST Governance and Convening Group, which organizes these calls. We're going to meet soon, we hope, to kind of get a state of where we are. This is a big week in systemic finance with Investment Integration Project happening on Tuesday, the Rio Transcap Summit happening right now. So we want to digest and reflect for those that got to participate in those spaces and where we move next. As I mentioned, the FEST Finance Group, and then Fyodor, the Sensing and Field Mapping Group. And then we have a number of other initiatives. So if these sound interesting to you, my email's in the invite for this call. Please reach out, and I'm happy to connect you to these groups. There's additional work that has emerged from FEST, including a research community that's going to be publishing a paper in Nature Sustainability, developing the field of systemic finance. This is mostly researchers and practitioners in the field. Steve Waddell mentioned his LPFN effort that I'm part of, and others were invited to participate in that emerging structure. Please reach out if this is of interest to you. And yeah, reach out to join. We're so excited to see this community grow based on the speed of trust. So happy to have Jessyca join us today and looking to hopefully more collaborations and partnerships going forward.
All right, thank you both. And thank you all for joining today's call and your openness to share and just listen and hold space in this room. So as we end the call, I want us to name one thing. You can name one thing that's on your mind as you leave this call. Feel free to unmute, feel free to drop it in the chat.
The quote from Andrew Carnegie that Jessyca shared, and particularly this last line saying that we can't trust, we're trustees for the poor because the rich can administer this wealth far better than the community could have done for itself. Wow.
Yeah. A lot to sit with, very telling. Kyrie says, super grateful for the heart everyone brings. Practical hope. Gratitude, enthusiasm, and hope.
Betterment.
Oh, betterment. Feeling less of an outsider now. Wonderful. Just transition as a vision and a path. Well, thank you for all your reflections. I feel like this has been a wonderful call where it's reoriented us towards practical things we can do and just reinvigorated that sense of hope and calm that there are things we can do about this and it's within our scope to be able to do it. So thank you so much, Jessyca. We're grateful for your time and insights. And thank you all for coming. See you all next time.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Perpetua and Tatiana.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jessyca.
Bye bye.
Thanks all.